Her work increasingly over the last 5 or 7 years has been on issues in abortion, in terms of access and effects of abortion. And therefore, what she's talking about tonight is exactly that. It's her work on the abortion issue, and in particular, her work as the lead person in working out the amicus brief that was filed with the Dobbs case, which is being decided this term in the Supreme Court. Caitlin, you're on.
So it's super nice to be here, and really a moment to talk about what happens if Roe is overturned, because most likely Roe is about to be overturned. And it really kind of takes me aback to remember that it was only 3 years ago in 2019 that I was having a conversation with some data journalists at the New York Times, and we were discussing the possibility of creating a piece for the Upshot that visualized a post-Roe United States. And I was sort of pitching the idea, they were listening, and like good journalists, they were kind of pushing back, and they were like, you know, is this like a sky is falling kind of thing? Is Roe really, is there any universe in which Roe is about to be overturned? And I said, well, I think so. That's what I'm hearing from attorneys in particular at the time. And so they kind of went off and talked to an editor and discussed it amongst themselves, and they came back and we decided to do the piece, and we published it in 2019. And since then, they've run it 2 more times with updated data, and we've never again discussed whether it was potentially alarmist. And when this talk was advertised, I received no emails from anybody asking me if this was alarmist. So, you know, it may be the case that additional context isn't necessary. Maybe y'all are like just all following the abortion news. But I am going to start in this talk anyway, just in case, by not assuming your knowledge. Let's start by just contextualizing this moment for abortion access in the United States. Where have we been, and where are we about to go? And then I'll talk more specifically about the economist amicus brief in the Dobbs case that the Supreme Court is deciding, with particular focus on what is likely to happen in the days, the weeks, the months, the years following Roe's reversal. So I should mention, by way of disclosure, that I also, in addition to this whole professoring gig at Middlebury, also have worked for several years as a consultant for Planned Parenthood and the Center for Reproductive Rights. In fact, that conversation I was having with the New York Times, I remember very vividly. I was having it in the baggage claim at the Richmond, Virginia airport, because I was working on a case down there with Planned Parenthood. And so like I'm kind of standing there going to this one case challenging a regulation, talking to them. Like this moment I think will forever be ingrained in my mind. It's kind of this pivotal moment where things were about to change, at least from my perspective and my understanding. I will say it's a complicated issue to decide as an academic whether you want to work as an expert witness or a consultant. I think Professor Hammermesh simply said, of course you should. That is your job. If you are a scientist and you produce evidence that is relevant and you believe in evidence-based policy, then you have an obligation to translate it for policymakers. And sometimes those policymakers end up being federal judges and show up and tell them what you know. Of course, there's also always kind of the flip side of this is that it could have the appearance or reality of being a conflict of interest. And so I, first of all, always disclose it. And I'll tell you, I agonized for a long time and said no for years before I started doing the work. And so if y'all want to talk about that at all, I'm generally pretty upfront about the pros and cons. But I will say I strive it as my job to be a dispassionate scientist. And so I am here today to talk about the facts as we know them. I'll leave a lot of the interpretation and the shoulds to y'all, and you'll probably feel differently about it. So let's think about where we've been and where we're going. I'm going to go actually way back. I'm going to start in the 1700s in the US. Abortion used to be kind of not such a big deal. In fact, it was common, it was legal, it was fairly accepted up until quickening, which is an old-fashioned term for the point at which a pregnant person can begin to feel fetal movement. At the same time, it was also pretty ineffectively practiced using like 18th century medicine. It was usually kind of potions and herbs of kind of varying and not fully known efficacy, combined with some really dangerous pre-antibiotics, pre-anesthesia era surgical practices that generally could be effective, but also posed grave risks to the woman. So in the mid-1800s, the newly formed American Medical Association began advocating for abortion bans across the country. People have a lot of opinions on exactly what their motives were, but I have this really weird hobby for an applied microeconomist who mostly deals in data. My weird hobby is that I read 19th century newspapers. I love reading 19th century newspapers. I do it all the time. I do it in the middle of the night when I have insomnia. And I often do it looking for stories about how people were talking in the 19th century about contraception and abortion. I'm just interested. It's not really my research. What I can say is from this era that when they were kind of advocating for these bans across the country, there's a real eugenics tone to it. Because in fact, what they were worried about at the time was declining marital fertility. Because it was married women who already had children who, at least anecdotally from this era, by and far were the primary demanders of abortion services. And so the bans eventually went through, it kind of took the rest of the 19th century. They go through. That doesn't mean abortion stopped. And if you read 19th century newspapers, you have no trouble. You will just routinely encounter stories like this. I like Vermont papers the best because I live in Vermont. This is a story from Vermont, which y'all can't necessarily read back there, but it is just kind of a quick piece from my hometown paper. This is my hometown, my current town paper, from 1877 about a married woman who traveled to Rutland, Vermont to get an abortion, developed sepsis, and died, leaving 2 small children. These are routine 19th century occurrences. And it did not end in the 19th century. It's easy, like you could kind of go into the 20th, and there's all sorts of continued kind of coded advertisements for ways to obtain abortion, including Lysol, which was used both as a contraceptive douche and to induce abortions through horrible, painful, very dangerous mechanisms. But you would see advertisements like this, like calendar face, that all-revealing look of a fear-haunted wife. It's very coded, like ads for abortion. Abortion continued even while it was illegal. And it was in the 1960s and 1970s as part of the burgeoning youth rights movement, combined with a kind of burgeoning, or renewed perhaps, women's rights movement, that there was a huge push both for access to contraception and the legalization of abortion. And it's in the late 60s that states began reforming and repealing their abortion bans. And what's perhaps particularly key is that 5 states in the District of Columbia completely repealed their abortion bans between 1970 and 1971 before Roe v. Wade did the same thing for the rest of the country. And that's going to come back in a minute in this talk. So just keep that in mind. California, New York, Washington, Alaska, Hawaii, Washington, D.C., all repealed their abortion bans. And then in 1973 in Roe v. Wade, the US Supreme Court recognized a constitutional right to privacy that extended to the right to abortion. And it's that moment, kind of up until 1973, the right to regulate abortion, like most medical services, primarily was a state right. This individual states had the right, and that's why some of them banned it and some of them had started to legalize it. In 1973 with Roe v. Wade, all of a sudden what the Supreme Court says is, you can't ban it. And they established, for those of y'all who are kind of pre-law, law scholars, it was a strict scrutiny standard. And here's my version of what that means. It was really, really hard for states to regulate abortion under that standard. Like it was quite questionable, like how far they could go. But they did start trying almost immediately in the wake of Roe. So they start trying to regulate abortion. They start passing mandatory waiting periods, spousal consent laws, parental consent laws, regulations on providers. And these laws started getting challenged. They started going to court. And it really took a long time for one of them. It was a 1980 Pennsylvania regulation that finally made it to the Supreme Court again in the second landmark case, Planned Parenthood v. Casey in 1992. And Planned Parenthood v. Casey was a very narrow decision. At the time, it seemed very likely that Roe might be overturned. And it was upheld by a narrow 5-4 margin. And what the court did kind of as a compromise to make that happen was they abandoned the strict scrutiny standard and they replaced it with an undue burden standard. So what the court said in Casey is they said, first of all, it's a big deal for us to overturn a precedent that we sent 25 years ago. The Supreme Court does not like to overturn its own precedents. It has this principle of stare decisis that is supposed to maintain its legitimacy. It can't go willy-nilly changing its mind every other year, right? So the first thing this court says is, like, we don't like to overturn our own precedents. Since Roe was decided, there's been societal reliance on abortion. Women use it to plan their fertility and plan their lives. They expect to have access to it. We can't go overturning it. However, we're going to return some regulatory power to the states. Now the standard is we're going to balance whatever kind of legitimate medical kind of regulatory interests the states might have in regulating abortion against any obstacles it presents in the paths of people seeking abortions. And what the court said is if those obstacles are large, there's an undue burden of the regulation and it's not constitutional. And that is the guidance the Supreme Court gave to federal courts and states in regulating abortions. They can't impose an undue burden. So in the wake of Casey, so this is a graph from the Guttmacher Institute, which is kind of a reproductive rights policy think tank with a political agenda. It's based in New York. They do a lot of quite good data work. They publish a lot of data that even like the CDC will cite Guttmacher. One of the things they've been doing is counting abortion regulations passed by states. And if you pause and think about it, it's really hard to count abortion regulations. Like imagine a state passes a set of regulations about like the physical capital, like the building an abortion provider's in. And they're like the fire extinguisher has to be 18 inches from the door and you have to have your own HVAC room and you have to have wide enough halls for a gurney. Is that one regulation or three? I don't know. Luckily, I'm not going to rely on any regulation counts. I'm just going to tell you a general story that I think this tells, which is in the wake of Casey in 1992, we start to see an uptick in abortion regulations. And those regulations are primarily what economists call demand-side regulations. They are targeting the people seeking abortions. They're regulations like mandatory waiting periods for abortion, that you have to like travel to a provider, go back home, wait 24, 48, 72 hours, then go back to the provider. They're parental involvement laws for minors seeking abortions, but they're really in this early period focused on the demanders. Those pretty much saturate all of the states that want to enforce them. More than half the states do enforce them now. And then abortion opponents really have a shift in strategy in the last 10 years. They begin to shift from regulating the demanders of abortion to regulating the suppliers of abortion. And a lot of people call these targeted regulation of abortion laws or trap laws, of abortion provider laws, trap laws. And so these are laws that impose like really expensive facility requirements. And so for instance, they say abortion facilities have to meet the standards of an ambulatory surgical center. Those are very expensive standards to meet. It's very expensive to upgrade a facility to that. It's very difficult for providers in some states to rent facilities anyway. It's hard for them to move. So this is just very expensive. And by the way, they have to do it in most of these states, even if they only provide medication abortion, in which case they're providing somebody with a pill and the person's going home where the abortion occurs. And yet the provider has to meet the standards of a provider of surgery. They also involve things like admitting privilege requirements for physicians. And so these are all requirements that are difficult for providers to meet. And we start to see closures of abortion providers kind of in the last decade. So these supply side regulations have much greater direct effect on abortion access in the last decade as these providers start to close. So not quite sure how Guttmacher's counting, but this is kind of the point they were making when they published this graph in 2021, saying, actually, if you look at kind of the entire post-Roe period, a whole lot of what's happened has been happening very recently. Like there's been this huge push in the regulatory environment. And then, Dan doesn't like this picture. And then, so we have the Trump presidency, and President Trump, has the opportunity to appoint 3 Supreme Court justices. And that's the moment when most people would say, the writing's probably on the wall for Roe. And states really quickly began to kind of flood in the last 2 years and start enacting abortion bans, like flat out bans. Those bans are blatantly unconstitutional under Roe and Casey. And everybody knows it, at least for the outright bans, not Texas's creative SB 8. Everybody knows it. The stated goal of the legislatures is we want to challenge Roe. Like that is what they're doing. They want to get it to the Supreme Court. And the one that makes it to the Supreme Court is a ban out of Mississippi, one of several bans in Mississippi. Mississippi's legislature enacted a 15-week abortion ban. It is clearly not constitutional. The sole provider of abortion in Mississippi is Jackson Women's Health. There's only one facility in the whole state that provides abortions. They filed suit with support from the Center for Reproductive Rights. The district court in Mississippi said, yeah, Mississippi, you can't enforce this. It's unconstitutional under Roe. They appealed to the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, which has generally been a thought to be regarded as a very conservative circuit court. And the Fifth Circuit basically wrote an opinion that said, yeah, we'd really like to uphold this, but we clearly can't under Roe. And so then the state of Mississippi appealed it to the Supreme Court. And what's interesting about that appeal, there's a couple interesting things, but one of them is because the law was blatantly unconstitutional, hardly any evidence was presented to the district and the circuit court. They didn't really collect any evidence. They were just like, yeah, no. What evidence are we going to collect? So there was very little evidence presented. The Supreme Court didn't get much of a body of evidence when this appeal was filed with them. The Supreme Court set on this request for cert, this request to hear the case. It either set a record or is like the second longest they set while they were deciding. And while they were deciding, Ruth Bader Ginsburg passed away. There was a new justice appointed. And then right after that, they granted cert and they said, we're going to hear Dobbs. So this case is widely believed to be the case that will determine the fate of Roe. A lot of people have been paying attention to like Texas's ban, but in some ways, I think it's something of a sideshow, not for Texas women, but for watching the court. It's Dobbs where the court has been asked very specifically to overturn Roe. That is what they have been asked to do. And the decision they release will be a decision about that. They're going to have to be clear about their intentions, right? But clear about whether Roe will be upheld or not. So that's where we are right now. And the question some of you might be wondering, maybe not, maybe you're all economists and you know that economists have something to say about just about everything, or at least we think we do. Dan is the author of Economics is Everywhere, right? We have something to say about everything. But some of you might be like, if you're not an economist, why is an economist talking to me about abortion, right? Like, what does an economist have to say about this complicated history? What does an economist have to say about constitutional law? What does an economist have to say about when life begins? What does an economist have to say about ethics? I hope we have some things to say about ethics. But today, those aren't issues that I'll tackle. And I won't assume that we all feel the same way about abortion. As Dan mentioned, I am from the Deep South, and I know and love and have Thanksgiving dinner with lots of people who feel differently than I do about abortion. And I fully recognize that there are good people who feel differently about this very thorny issue, and that if you actually survey people in the United States, it does depend a little bit on how you ask the question, but it's fair to say they're pretty divided. And they've been pretty divided equally for a really long time. So if you think everybody feels the same way as you do about abortion, you're just wrong, and you shouldn't assume it, and I'm not going to assume it. But we don't all have to feel the same way about abortion to feel the same way about the scientific method and the evidence it produces. Like, we are going to traffic in facts. They can inform our understanding of this case and this situation. They will not answer all the questions, but we can answer some very specific ones. And that's what an economist has to say about abortion. I actually didn't expect to have any of it to say in this case because I thought, like, when I knew this case was coming to the court, and I do talk to attorneys at the Center for Reproductive Rights, and I talked a little bit about what was happening, but for some reason, I fully expected Mississippi's full-on assault on Roe would be about constitutional law, whether there's a right to privacy in the Constitution, and like it would be about law and jurisprudence. Here's where I was foolish. Because it's a really big deal for the court to overturn its own precedent, which Mississippi is asking it to do, Mississippi is going to make a case for why the court should do it. Why is it okay to overturn this precedent? And the case that Mississippi ended up making when it filed its big brief with the court, one of the pillars of its case is there is, in fact, no societal reliance on abortion. When Casey upheld Roe, the court said there's societal reliance on abortion. When Mississippi came back and asked them to reconsider this year, what they said is, these are quotes from the brief. I'm going to give you several to kind of give you a sense of what the argument is. The march of progress has left Roe and Casey behind. Sweeping policy advances now promote women's full pursuit of both career and family. Roe suggested that without abortion, unwanted children could force upon women a stressful life and future. But numerous laws enacted since Roe, addressing pregnancy discrimination, requiring leave time, assisting with childcare, and more, facilitate the ability of women to pursue both career success and a rich family life. Casey added, so now they're kind of turning to Casey. Casey added, The ability of women to participate equally in the economic and social life of the nation has been facilitated by their ability to control their reproductive lives. This is not a decision, an assessment the court was in a position to make. Casey gives no good reason to believe that decades of advances for women rest on Roe, and evidence is to the contrary. So when Mississippi files this brief, they want evidence to back it up, and keep in mind, very little evidence was presented as part of the case. So the evidence is going to come in when Mississippi files their brief, and then what happens in the Supreme Court is the parties will file briefs, and then these friends of the parties, the amici, I don't know how you say the plural actually, they will file, Dan gonna tell me?
I think I use on that plural.
Amicus? Thanks. I've only ever been one of them. So they will file an amicus brief. And they will say to the court, like, here's what we know. And people file amicus briefs on both sides. So there was this group of 240 women scholars and professional organizations. And even though I'm being recorded and generally very careful, I'm actually going to pause and just be snarky here because it objectively deserves it. These 240 women scholars, I don't recognize a single one of them. I don't know other women scholars who do. Most of them, they have a college degree and then they're just working somewhere. They're like an accountant. They have opinions, but what they're doing in this brief, if they were filing a brief about their opinion, fine. But they're filing a brief about facts, supposedly. And I don't feel that they are qualified to provide the following supposed facts. They say claiming women have relied upon abortion for their advancement ignores the simultaneity of legal, cultural, technological, and other events affecting women over at least the past 5 decades. It's impossible to claim that abortion access is especially responsible for the progress American women have made. There is no study design that could credibly tease out a causal link. There is simply no causal link between the availability of abortion and the capacity of women to act in society. I feel that these are contradictory. I don't think you can simultaneously say there's no way to know there's a causal link and there's no causal link. I think they need to pick one, but they say both. And that's really when this brief got filed, I got a text from an attorney. It was like, have you read the brief? And I was like, no. And she's like, you should read it. And I feel like I must be very predictable because the moment I read the brief, I texted back and I was like, the economists have something to say. Right? We have a lot to say about this. This notion that people are now just effortlessly balancing their economic and financial lives and parenthood, I mean, economists know a lot about that. So actually do most human beings who have observed parenthood. But economists have quantitative evidence. And economists have a lot to say about causality and how we tease out causal effects. And so that is what prompted me to spearhead this economist brief and more than 150 economists to join it. And I'll say, even though I'm spearheading it, as I was drafting it, I had 7 other economists who work in the field who were following along, reading it, commenting it, so that we could be really, really sure that everything we said in the brief was widely accepted evidence, and that I wanted everybody's eyes on it to be really careful. And then other people who signed on, including people in this room, also had eyes on it. So here's what we say in this brief. And it'll answer the question to some extent, what happens if Roe falls? We make 4 points. Point number 1, there in fact is a way to credibly tease out causal links. Point number 2, we've done it, and we have very strong causal evidence that Roe changed the arc of women's lives. Point number 3, Roe has not become irrelevant. The march of progress has not left it behind. We still know abortion access causally affects people's lives. And point number 4, if Roe is overturned, we have a pretty good idea of what will happen next, and we can give you an estimate of how many people won't be able to reach abortion providers and think through the implications of that for their lives. So that's the basic outline of the brief. So let's go through each of those 4 parts kind of briefly at a high level. I'm curious, how many of you students have taken econometrics? Yeah, okay, you're like my people. So how many of you have taken statistics? Okay, so in statistics, did somebody tell you correlation isn't causation? Thank God. It's not. But here's where they usually stop in statistics, is they're correlation isn't causation, and they stop before the super, super exciting point, which is there have been enormous advances in methodologies that have allowed us in many situations to credibly figure out when it actually is reasonable to regard a statistical correlation as causal. There's a lot of methodologies. And this image is alluding to the fact that in some ways, when you think about that causal inference, using a result to infer something about causality, we're thinking about viewing a pair parallel universe. We're thinking about viewing, for instance, a world with and without Roe. That's our job, that's our task, that's how we're envisioning this. So if you can run an experiment or a randomized controlled trial, which some of your professors do quite often, if you can run an experiment, that is a great, excellent, perhaps gold standard approach to causal inference, right? Like if you think about testing a COVID vaccine, you randomize assignment to one group, you have a placebo group that's not really getting it, you compare what happens to them, and given that you successfully achieved randomization in the first place, any differences in outcomes between the two groups can be credibly inferred to be the causal effect of the vaccine. So for me, if I want to know the causal effect of Roe on women's lives, and I want to run an experiment, what I've got to do is like rewind history a whole bunch of times, and just have Roe decided one way versus another, and then fast forward and see what happens. And obviously, I don't have a time machine, and I can't feasibly or ethically do this, right? So I am unfortunately often in situations where I can't run randomized controlled trials. I do sometimes. I've like run them for Planned Parenthood on like social media ads and whether it increases LARC use and other things, but like mostly I can't. And so when we're in those situations, we generally as social scientists turn to a different approach called a natural experiment, a situation we can argue, and we do argue a lot about them, but a situation we can argue if we buy the assumptions underlying the model, approximate a randomized controlled trial. So let me give you an example that's very specific to the Roe era, and it's an example of a methodology called difference in difference estimation applied to a natural experiment. So remember how I mentioned there were 5 repeal states, and they repealed their abortion bans and legalized abortion before Roe? So this is what happened to the birth rates in those 5 repeal states. They mostly did it in 1970. And so here's what you see. Their birth rates, you should always pay attention to the y-axis. It doesn't go down to 0. But their birth rates are going down from 17.5 to 16, just with that 1 year in between. Like there's a pretty big decrease in births. We don't know, though, that that's the causal effect of legalizing abortion. Maybe births were going to go down anyway. But we've got the whole rest of the country to help us figure that out. So if you look at what's happening to births in the whole rest of the country, they're going down some, but they're not going down as much. And the basic intuition of difference in difference estimation is we say that the trend for the rest of the country becomes our counterfactual, what we're willing to think would have happened to the repeal states, but for repeal. And to the extent that more happens, we infer that that's the causal effect of repeal. That's the basic idea. Now, we can gussy this up with a lot of fancy statistics and control variables and test for pre-trends and all sorts of fun stuff that if you take econometrics and like kind of subsequent advanced classes, you'll enjoy immensely. But that's, right? I don't know why y'all laughed. I know you enjoy it immensely. But that's the basic idea. And so we have tons of evidence using this approach with the repeal states that strongly points to Roe changing the arc of women's lives. It suggests, first of all, in terms of a first-order effect, that it dramatically, the legalization of abortion, dramatically reduced unintended births in the United States. It particularly did so for young unmarried women. The probability that a young woman would become a mother before the age of 20 decreased by about, I think I wrote it down, a third due to abortion legalization. And the probability that she would marry before 20 decreased by about a fifth. And it's explained almost entirely by a reduction in what were called shotgun marriages, marriages resulting from an unintended pregnancy. The reductions tended to be larger for Black women. This is probably in large part a socioeconomic status story. We don't have good markers for socioeconomic status, but Black women in this period in particular had, they tended, first of all, to be have lower income and less access to health care. So the kind of relevance of this policy to their lives is like it comes through in the data. It also reduced maternal mortality for Black women, legalization of abortion, by about 28 to 40%. So economists have then looked at like what were the downstream effects of this, like what happened next in women's lives. Now, it's more tricky, it's trickier to like kind of tease this out. There's a statistical power issue because lots of women in your sample, you're like looking at their education, you're looking at their earnings. They're not necessarily causally directly impacted, but there's a lot of methods people have used to try to tease out like who was and if the ability to not carry an unwanted pregnancy to term then affected their educational attainment and their earnings and the probability they were in poverty. And the answers from the Roe era are like, yes, it had big downstream effects on their lives. The legalization of abortion abortion allowed women experiencing unintended pregnancies to not give birth at that time, which had these downstream effects on poverty and education. So I think that if the 240 women scholars were kind of, if I stopped there, they would be like, okay, maybe there's this thing called causal inference, and maybe it's pretty good, and maybe you have this Roe era natural experiment, and maybe Roe era mattered. But remember, the march of progress has left Roe behind. Now we have all these amazing like pregnancy anti-discrimination laws and paid leave they cite. Don't know. They cited paid leave. We do not have a federal paid leave, if anybody's wondering. Don't know what that's all about at all. Very few states have it. So they cite leave policies, they cite anti-discrimination policies, and they're basically like, hey, now women can have it all, right? So don't worry. It might have mattered once, but it doesn't matter now. There's also not good reason to think that's the case. First of all, and I'm just going to give you some evidence that is just statistics and not causal inference, but one thing you should know is a lot of people still get abortions. It's not like a thing that's gone away. So nearly, with the existence of safe and effective contraceptives, nearly half of all pregnancies in the US remain unintended. Nearly half of those end in abortion. Both of those rates are falling, and they're falling fast and for really interesting reasons, but the numbers are still quite high, the levels are still quite high. About just under 1 in 5 pregnancies in the United States are aborted every year. That's about a little over 1% of US women of reproductive age, 15 to 44, have an abortion every year. If you're willing to extrapolate that to like a lifetime rate, like if they keep having abortions at those same rates that we see at each age, that would be about a quarter of US women having an abortion in their reproductive lifetime. So certainly if one wants to believe that contraceptives have obviated the need for abortion, its sheer commonness seems to suggest otherwise. And the second just kind of statistical fact that I'll give you is that becoming a parent is very strongly associated with economic outcomes for women, mostly not for men. So men and women's earnings actually trend pretty similarly when they're young, up until the point that they become parents, at which point like not much happens for men and women's just fall off a cliff. And we see this across like all developed countries, right? So it's very strongly associated with a reduction in earnings. The majority of US workers lack access to paid leave. Childcare, the brief also cited childcare subsidies, which I found bizarre. Childcare is very expensive. Childcare for a US infant is like about $10,000 a year. And we do have some federal subsidies, but they're very inadequate, generally very hard to get. And that assumes you can even get the childcare. A lot of low-income women are shift workers. They have very unpredictable schedules, which makes it extraordinarily difficult to plan for and obtain high-quality childcare when from any given moment you're not actually sure when you're working. And finally, the brief cites the social safety net. The social safety net, I would say, to put it mildly, is frayed. And the gains that we've had in the social safety net since the 90s have primarily been focused on women who work. And a lot of women who are facing an abortion decision, part of the issue is they don't know how they might continue to work should they choose to have this child. Like there might be this period where they have to kind of separate from work. And if they would like to use kind of the social safety net as it's available to women who aren't working, welfare benefits, for instance, have just been declining quite a bit over this period. And Mississippi, the state where this case is coming from, I want you to just think to yourself, imagine you're thinking about a family of 3. And imagine the state's going to give them a monthly benefit to support themselves. It's the welfare benefit. And I just want you to think in your head, you don't have to yell it out, just think what you think a reasonable amount to support a family of 3 every month is. Mississippi, until this year, would give them $170 a month. They just raised it to $220. That's the safety net if you're not going to work. You can also get things like WIC benefits, but like we're just talking about very low amounts of cash transfers available. And in fact, the women who seek abortions are disproportionately poor. The women who seek abortions in the United States, if there's kind of a modal person seeking an abortion, she is a woman. She is an adult. She already has children. More than half of people seeking abortions already have children. 3/4 of them are poor or low income. And 59% of them in surveys report that they are experiencing a disruptive life event, like they've just lost a job, they've just broken up with a partner, they're in danger of being evicted. I mean, seeking an abortion is not a random thing that happens to people. They are largely doing it because they're in a vulnerable place. And another thing to keep in mind about these women is that based on new evidence from some economists who linked survey evidence to Experian credit reports, and there is a whole issue there, by the way, if you want to think just about kind of ways people can use data to track everything about you, but they linked women in a survey to their Experian credit reports. And what we see is that the women who are seeking abortions, they are already very financially vulnerable at the time they're seeking abortions. And if they don't get the abortion, if they are turned away from the provider, in this case because they're just past a gestational age threshold, their financial circumstances deteriorate rapidly. And what you see is like a big increase in past due debt and adverse events like bankruptcies. Like they're vulnerable going there, and if they don't get it, what you tend to see next happen in their lives looks like in their financial lives, it looks pretty bad. Okay, so last point. What happens if Roe is overturned? Like we've made this argument, causal inference is possible. Roe did change the arc of women's lives, and we do know that people still use abortion right now. Abortion still matters. So what happens if it goes away? I don't have all the answers to that question, but I'm going to talk a little bit about what answers causal inference has provided us. So this is the current location of US abortion providers. I maintain a database of US abortion providers. I publish county-level travel distances on a monthly level for 2009 Ford at Open Science Framework. You can use it for any of your projects. I don't publish the identities and the geocoordinates of the providers, but you can obtain them through a data use agreement. But this right now is where US abortion providers are located and the average distance from each county to each provider. The average woman in the US right now lives about 25 miles from a provider. And although there is this kind of swath of dark down the middle of the country where people are more than 200 miles from a provider, not many people live there. And so less than 1% of the US population is more than 200 miles from a provider right now. If Roe is overturned, we have a very good idea of which states will immediately ban abortion. These states already have trigger laws in effect for 13 of them that explicitly say if Roe is overturned, abortion's banned here. The hour it happens, no more abortions here. The other states have clearly indicated a desire to ban abortion and would probably act very quickly to either enact a new ban or to begin to enforce a ban they've had on their books since before Roe, and they never repealed. They would just start enforcing it again. And so this is actually, the states that are outlined in red, this is actually a pretty conservative guess about which states would ban abortion. There's three really key states that I didn't shade: Kansas, Florida, and Wisconsin. And the reason I didn't shade them, Wisconsin currently has a Democratic governor standing in the way with veto power. It's a purple state. He could go. Abortion would fall in Wisconsin almost certainly. Kansas has a recognized state constitutional protection for abortion, but they have a ballot initiative they're about to vote on to amend the Constitution, and I think Kansas would fall. Florida's in a very similar situation to Kansas. So everything I'm about to tell you is actually a pretty conservative prediction because there's some key states that I think are also likely to fall. But I always like to go conservative on this. So I'm like, right now it couldn't fall in Kansas. Might be able to by June. I'll update the analysis, right? But so in this scenario, all of the red dots are providers that are forced to close. About 41% of US women live in areas that are affected. So of course, like people up in New York and Vermont, abortion's not gonna be banned here when Roe's overturned, almost certainly not. I'm not projecting anything happening up here. It's like the places I'm from, like rural Georgia and West Virginia and Louisiana and Texas. Like these are the places where this 41% of people live, where providers will close, travel distances will increase to an average of about 279 miles. About 70% of the women who live in the affected area will be more than 200 miles from a provider. So how many of them get out? There's states that will remain, right? Abortion is going to remain legal in New York, and people will come here. Abortion will remain legal most likely in New Mexico, and people will go to New Mexico. But I want you to keep in mind that the people who are seeking abortions are disproportionately poor mothers experiencing disruptive life events who are credit constrained. And so for me, like, I'm like a, upper class white lady, and if I need to travel 40 miles to get medical care, I will not think of twice about it. I'll just get in my car and go. But when you're in a different situation, that trip could look entirely different. So how many of them like actually get out? Oh, I just gave you those statistics, sorry. So that's where causal inference comes into play again. The economics literature has identified some recent natural experiments that have shocked the travel distances people seeking abortions face, and we've used those to estimate the causal effects of travel distance. We've done this actually in three different natural experiments, but I'm going to talk first about the one that came from Texas, and then I'll just kind of mention that there's others that back this up. So in 2013, Texas enacted a trap law that involved an admitting privileges requirement that Texas abortion providers mostly could not meet. And so it's actually, it was a trap law with admitting privileges and an ambulatory surgical center requirement, but the second one was only ever in effect for 2 weeks. So it's the first one that super mattered. And when that first one went into effect, all of a sudden a bunch of Texas providers closed. And that's the case that went to the US Supreme Court in Whole Woman's Health v. Hellerstedt in 2016. And the Supreme Court actually then struck down Texas's trap law. In oral arguments in that case, Justice Kagan was like, that's almost like the perfect controlled experiment. And it's my favorite quote of all time from a Supreme Court justice. You guys might have your own, but that is my favorite. Because Justice Kagan is exactly right. We have this great big state. These dots are all Texas providers. The black dots remained open right after this went into effect, although some of them have closed. The gray dots closed. And all of a sudden, travel distance gets shocked in some places in Texas and not in others. And so like economists, the moment we see this, everybody was like, that's a natural experiment. And 3 different teams of economists all started independently like working on papers. I'm on one of those teams. It's not surprising when something like this happens that the economists like flock in. So we're flocking in, we're all working on it, we're all seeing like the same natural experiment, we're working independently, and we're estimating. I cannot give a talk without putting a regression on a slide. Like, I just can't. I tried really hard, and I just can't. We are estimating these models that have 2-way fixed effects, where we're basically asking the question, when travel distances go up more in County A than they do in County B, do abortions go down more in County A than they do in County B? That's what the fancy model asks. And they let us measure the causal effect of travel distance along a continuum. And the results, which were completely similar across the 3 independent groups working on it, this graph is from my group because I like my own graph, but we all got the same answer, really. The results were increases in travel distance are a very large obstacle to people seeking abortions. In fact, the magnitudes of the effects were beyond any that the courts had previously considered. When federal judges were talking about distance, they'd be like, oh, is it more than 200 miles, 250? 25 miles matters. These are poor women in difficult situations. So what we estimate is that if the nearest clinic is 5 miles away and it closes, and the next nearest clinic's 30 miles away, it's like a 25-mile increase, 10% of people seeking abortions won't be able to get there. That's the estimate. Now, what's interesting about that is this is a diminishing marginal effect. And if you think about it, it's going to make a lot of sense. Going from, let's say, 0 to 25, that's a bigger deal than going from 300 to 325. By the time you're at 300, the people who can't get there, like, they already can't get there, might as well be on the moon. They don't care that it went up to 325. And so that's what we found. Like, the initial effects are really big. So the places where clinic closures matter the most are the places where the clinics are located. The outlying areas don't get shocked as much. Is that my timer? That's good, because I'm really close to being done. So these effects are big, and these effects have been replicated in other settings. They've been replicated in Wisconsin, where we see really similar effects of clinic closures from a 4th independent research team. They have been replicated. I have a new working paper that uses all the clinic closures and openings in the United States over the past 10 years to estimate the same model. Pink places, distance is going up. Green places, it's going down. I get super similar effects. So this suggests that these results have external validity. Like, we just keep seeing the same thing everywhere we look. Like, it's very similar. So if you're willing to believe that it's very similar, then what you can do is take those estimates, take the predicted changes in distance, and then predict how many people won't be able to get out and obtain an abortion in another state. So that estimate, and it depends on which of these papers you use, so I'm just going to give you a range. In the affected regions, I predict that about a quarter to a third of people who want abortions won't be able to get out and reach a provider. I don't think I did that. Won't be able to get out and reach a provider, a quarter to a third. Now, what do they do? Some of them might try to mail order abortion pills. They won't reach a provider, but what they'll try to do is get abortion pills on the black market. However, I'll tell you two things that work against the idea that this is going to be a huge outlet. First of all, the states that want to ban abortion are going to do everything they can to limit the distribution of these pills as well. Like, they are on it, they see it, they know. Secondly, when I estimate these effects in the big national study, I'm also able to estimate effects on birth rates, and those show that about 3/4 of the people who don't reach a provider give birth. And they're estimated in a context, you can mail order these pills right now, they're estimated in a context where these pills are available, and we still see them giving birth. And I actually think that these estimates are probably conservative, because these estimates are all entirely based on the assumption that when the women get out and they get to a provider, that provider can see them. They can absorb this enormous influx of hundreds of thousands of women traveling out of southern and Midwestern states with bans to states like New York. And to prepare to analyze that question, I just had a team of 20 Middlebury College students conduct a survey of every US abortion facility to see what their appointment availability is right now. And this is the distribution of business days until the next available appointment. There's plenty of places where it's like same day, next day, 2 days, nothing too shocking. But there's also quite a few, like about 20% of US abortion facilities where it's more than 10 business days, or they were told there's no appointments available at all, we can't help you. And these facilities, and I'm creating a map, I'm actually working on a visualization of this tomorrow, I'm meeting with 538. They're visualizing it, so stay tuned. I think we'll publish it next week, and you can see like where these places are, but I'll give it away right now. They're the states surrounding Texas. They're the states where Texas women are flowing out because Texas has a partial ban in effect right now. And even if you get out, they can't see you. Every facility in Oklahoma, every single one, said we can't schedule you. Every one of them. So these assumptions, like these numbers I'm giving you, these are based on the idea that that flow of women will be seen, but that's really not necessarily clearly the case. And so where I would leave you is with what I think is a very conservative estimate that if and when Roe is overturned this summer, and most court watchers expect it's a win, that we're going to see conservatively about 80,000 people in the first year who want abortions who can't reach providers, and that about 60,000 of them will give birth as a result. And based on everything we know about the financial vulnerability of these people and the impact of having a child on women's workforce participation and earnings, it will have downstream effects on their economic lives. I feel like I should end on a different note, but that's my conclusion.